The small roadside diner sat under the dim glow of flickering neon lights, its parking lot half empty, save for a few old trucks and dusty sedans. Inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee and sizzling bacon, the same as it did every night. Lily adjusted her apron, the fabric worn thin from years of use, and let out a quiet sigh. Her shift had started hours ago, but exhaustion had already settled deep into her bones. Lily was used to long nights like this. As a single mother, she had no choice but to keep pushing forward, working double shifts just to keep the electricity on and food on the table. Tonight, however, was harder than most. It was her son Oliver's birthday. He had turned 8 today, but instead of blowing out candles and unwrapping presents, he was home alone, probably waiting for her by the window, his tiny hands pressed against the glass, hoping she'd walk in early just this once. But she wouldn't. With a forced smile, she approached table 4, where a group of truckers were laughing loudly over their half-finished plates. She topped off their coffee without a word, tuning out their crude jokes, their heavy boots scraping against the linoleum floor. The doorbell jingled. Another customer. Lily glanced up, ready to offer the usual robotic greeting, but what she saw made her pause. A man stepped inside, his hood pulled over his head, a duffel bag slung over one shoulder. His posture was relaxed, almost too relaxed, as if he was deliberately trying to blend into the background. But there was something about him, something familiar. His face was partially shadowed by the dim lights, but Lily caught the sharpness of his features, the unmistakable warmth in his eyes. She had seen that face before. Somewhere. She swallowed, shaking off the strange feeling creeping up her spine. Probably just another traveler passing through. Nothing more. The man walked past the empty tables, choosing a seat in the farthest corner of the diner, his back to the wall. He placed his bag beside him, scanning the room with a quiet, measured gaze before picking up the menu. Lily grabbed her notepad and took a deep breath, steadying herself before heading over. "Good evening," she said, forcing a polite smile. "What can I get you?" The man looked up at her, and in that moment, Lily felt an odd sense of déjà vu. His eyes were kind yet piercing, like he could see right through her. "Just some tea," he said, his voice smooth, gentle. "And maybe a plate of dumplings, if you have any." Lily scribbled the order, nodding quickly. "Coming right up." As she turned away, she couldn't shake the feeling that this night was about to take an unexpected turn. Little did she know, the stranger sitting in the corner wasn't just another traveler. He was Jackie Chan. And before the night was over, he would change her life forever. Lily placed the order slip on the counter and stepped back, rubbing her temple with 2 fingers as the heat from the kitchen mixed with the growing tightness in her chest. The night felt heavier than usual, pressing down on her like an invisible weight. She hated this feeling, the sensation that something was about to shift, that a moment she wasn't prepared for was just around the corner. Her instincts were rarely wrong, but she had no time to entertain them. The bell above the kitchen window dinged, signaling an order ready for pickup, but it wasn't for the man in the corner. His tea hadn't even been poured yet. She turned back toward the counter, reaching for a clean cup, but the feeling wouldn't leave her. Her hands moved mechanically, filling the cup with hot water, setting a tea bag inside, and placing it carefully on a small saucer, but her thoughts remained stuck on the stranger. There was something about the way he carried himself, the way his presence filled the space without effort, the way he had looked at her when he placed his order. Not with arrogance, not with entitlement, but with something else. She pushed the cup onto a tray, added the plate of dumplings the cook had just slid onto the counter, and took a deep breath before making her way back to the table. The man sat exactly as before, one arm resting casually on the table, the other draped over the back of the seat. He wasn't on his phone like most travelers, wasn't fidgeting, wasn't in any rush. He was simply waiting, watching. When Lily approached, he gave her a small nod, a quiet acknowledgement that felt oddly significant. She placed the tray down, careful not to let her fingers tremble as she set the tea in front of him. "Here you go. Let me know if you need anything else." His lips curled slightly at the corners, something that wasn't quite a smile but wasn't nothing either. "Thank you." His voice was soft but firm, the kind of voice that could command a room without needing to be raised. He reached for the tea, but didn't drink, letting it sit between his hands as if warming his fingers. Lily hesitated for a second longer than she should have, waiting for something, though she wasn't sure what. He wasn't like the usual customers who passed through, people who barely looked at her, who saw nothing but a waitress with tired eyes and a fake smile. He saw something, and that made her uneasy. Before she could force herself to turn away, he spoke again. "Long shift?" Lily blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Customers didn't ask her things like that. They placed orders, sometimes mumbled thanks, and that was it. They didn't care how long she had been on her feet, how many times she had forced a smile when she wanted to scream, how badly she wished she was anywhere else. She forced a small chuckle, shaking her head. Yeah, always. His gaze didn't waver, and something about it made her feel like she had to keep talking. Been here for a while now. The hours aren't great, but it's work. She expected him to nod absent-mindedly, maybe say something generic in return, but he didn't. He just listened, as if what she had said actually mattered. He finally lifted the tea to his lips, taking a small sip before setting it back down. You have kids? Lily stiffened. It wasn't the question itself that threw her, it was the way he asked, like he already knew the answer. She wasn't sure why, but lying didn't even feel like an option. Yeah, a son. Oliver. He turned 8 today. His expression shifted slightly, though she couldn't quite place the emotion behind it. And you're here instead of with him? Lily let out a breath that felt heavier than expected. That's how it is, she said, her voice quieter than before. I wish I was home right now, celebrating with him. But wishes don't pay the bills. The man watched her for a moment, eyes searching her face for something she wasn't sure she had the strength to show. He didn't say anything right away, just picked up his chopsticks and took a bite of the dumplings. Lily should have left by now, should have been tending to other tables, refilling coffee cups, pretending she wasn't standing here letting a stranger make her feel more seen than she had in years. But for some reason she stayed. You're a good mother, he finally said, setting his chopsticks down with careful precision. The kind who puts her child first, even when it hurts. Lily's throat tightened, and she immediately forced a laugh, shaking her head. You don't even know me. He tilted his head slightly, studying her with a patience that unnerved her. I don't need to. The words cut through her like a blade, hitting something raw and unguarded. She had spent years convincing herself she was doing the right thing, that working endless shifts and missing moments with Oliver was necessary, that she had no choice. But hearing it from a stranger, a man who had no reason to say it, no reason to offer anything but a passing exchange, it felt different. It felt real. Lily glanced away, swallowing the lump in her throat, before forcing herself to take a step back. She gestured vaguely toward the rest of the diner, toward the other customers who probably needed refills, the tables that needed cleaning, anything to break the intensity of the moment. The man didn't stop her, didn't press any further. He simply nodded, returning to his meal as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just unraveled something inside her with a few simple words. Lily turned quickly, forcing herself to move, to push the conversation out of her head. But no matter how many plates she cleared, how many orders she took, how many forced smiles she gave, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something she wasn't ready to face. And for reasons she didn't yet understand, she found herself glancing back at him, half expecting him to disappear like a dream she wasn't supposed to remember. But he was still there, still watching, and she had no idea why that unsettled her so much. Lily forced herself to focus on the tasks piling up around her. The truckers at table 4 were getting louder, laughing over something that wasn't funny, their plates pushed to the edge of the table, waiting to be cleared. A couple near the window was staring at their phones, barely touching their food. At the counter, a man tapped his fingers impatiently, waiting for a refill. The diner was the same as it always was, chaotic in the way small-town places like this tended to be. But her mind wasn't on any of it. It was still at the corner table, still stuck on the man who spoke like he knew her life, who looked at her like she was more than just another exhausted woman scraping by. She clenched her jaw and grabbed the coffee pot, moving from table to table, pouring refills, wiping crumbs, responding to empty pleasantries with nods that meant nothing. The longer she avoided looking at him, the harder it became to pretend he wasn't there. But every time she glanced in his direction, he was exactly the same, calm, quiet, eating slowly as if time wasn't something he had to worry about. People didn't act like that here. Travelers rushed through meals, barely looked up from their phones, left behind crumpled napkins and half-eaten plates before disappearing back onto the highway. But he wasn't in a rush. He wasn't passing through like everyone else. And that made her nervous. She had seen strange customers before, people who came in from the road with stories they never shared, men who drank their coffee in silence, women who whispered into their phones like someone was listening. But none of them felt like this. None of them made her chest tighten like she was on the verge of something she didn't understand. When she finally made her way back to his table, she kept her voice even, her expression unreadable. Everything okay? He looked up from his plate, nodding once. It's good. Thank you. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the notepad she hadn't even needed to use for his order. Where are you headed? She didn't know why she asked. It wasn't something she usually cared about. People left. That was the only thing that mattered. They came in, they ate, they walked out the door, and they never thought about her again. But for some reason, she wanted to know. He set his chopsticks down, considering her question for a moment before answering. Nowhere specific. Just passing through. His response was simple, but there was something deliberate about it, something that made her think he wasn't being entirely honest. There was no luggage with him, just the worn-out duffel bag beside his seat. No signs of exhaustion from the road, no hurried glances at the clock like most travelers who had somewhere else to be. He was sitting like a man with nowhere to go, or like a man who had chosen to be here. She tried to brush off the unease creeping up her spine. Well, if you need anything else, just let me know. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her before she could take a step. You work every night? She glanced back at him, caught off guard by the directness of the question. It wasn't unusual for customers to make small talk, but this was different. He wasn't just making conversation. He was asking because he wanted to know. Most of them, she admitted. Bills don't pay themselves. He nodded slowly, his gaze unreadable. And your son? Her stomach twisted. It wasn't the question itself. It was the way he asked it, like he already knew the answer. She didn't like how that felt. He understands, she said, though she wasn't sure that was true. Oliver never complained, never asked for more than she could give, but she had seen the way his smile faded when she left for work, the way he tried to be brave when she promised to make it up to him. He never said he was lonely, but he didn't have to. She could feel it. The man exhaled, tapping his fingers once against the edge of his teacup before speaking again. It's hard, isn't it? Choosing between what they need and what they want. Lily stiffened, something sharp twisting in her chest. I do what I have to. He didn't argue, didn't push, just nodded as if he understood exactly what she meant. Maybe he did. Maybe that was the problem. The bell above the door jingled again, and Lily turned, grateful for the distraction. A group of teenagers walked in, laughing too loudly, their presence immediately shifting the energy in the diner. She glanced back at the man's table, but he had already turned his attention back to his food, as if their conversation had never happened. Lily forced herself to move, to focus on anything else. She took orders, refilled drinks, wiped down counters, but no matter how busy she kept herself, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The air felt heavier, like the diner had become smaller, like there wasn't enough space to breathe. When she finally looked back at the corner booth again, she expected to see him still sitting there, still watching the world with the same quiet patience. But the seat was empty. His plate was clean, the tea finished, the duffel bag gone. For a second, she thought maybe she had imagined him. Maybe he had been some strange trick of exhaustion, some fragment of a dream she had walked into without realizing it. But then she saw it. An envelope, sitting neatly beside the salt shaker. Her pulse quickened. Customers didn't leave things behind. Not here. Not like this. She wiped her hands on her apron, forcing herself to walk toward the table, to reach for the envelope even though something inside her told her she wasn't ready for whatever was inside. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. It wasn't sealed, just folded neatly. No name on the front. No writing at all. Her heart pounded as she opened it, pulling out the single piece of paper tucked inside. She read the words once. Then again. Then again. And then her knees nearly buckled. She had spent years believing nothing would change, that the world didn't care, that no one was coming to save her. She had told herself she was strong enough to handle it, that she didn't need help, that she didn't need anyone. But as she stared down at the note in her hands, she realized she had been wrong. Because Jackie Chan had just proven otherwise. Lily's hands gripped the edges of the note so tightly that the paper nearly crumpled between her fingers. Her breathing was uneven, her heart hammering against her ribs as her eyes darted across the neatly written words over and over again. The message was simple, written in precise strokes, and yet it carried a weight that made it impossible to move, impossible to think. You are stronger than you realize. No mother should have to choose between survival and time with her child. This isn't charity, it's a thank you. For all the love, the effort, the fight you put in every single day. Use it for something that makes you and your son smile. Jackie Chan. Beneath the note, folded with deliberate care, was a check. The moment she saw the number, her breath caught in her throat. It was more than she had ever held in her hands, more than she could earn in years working shifts at this diner. Her vision blurred at the edges, and for the first time in a long time, she felt something crack deep inside her chest. The exhaustion, the endless strain, the night spent wondering if she was failing her son, if he would grow up resenting her for never being home, It all came crashing down at once. She stared at the check as if it might disappear, as if she had imagined it, as if this was some cruel trick her exhausted mind had created to give her a moment of hope before reality set in. But it was real. It was sitting in her hands, solid, undeniable, impossible to ignore. A voice broke through the fog clouding her mind. "Lily? Are you okay?" Her co-worker, Danielle, stood near the counter, a tray in her hand, watching her with narrowed eyes. Lily forced herself to breathe, to loosen the death grip she had on the check before she ruined it. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, and quickly folded the note and the check back into the envelope, shoving it against her chest as if that might stop the way her heart was racing. Her voice cracked, so she cleared her throat, trying to steady herself. "I'm fine." Danielle didn't look convinced. "You don't look fine." Lily shook her head, gripping the envelope even tighter. "It's nothing," she exhaled sharply, struggling to find words that made sense. "It's a lot." Danielle glanced at the table, at the empty plate and the untouched salt shaker, then back at Lily. Her eyes dropped to the envelope clutched in Lily's hands, and something in her expression shifted. She didn't ask, but she didn't need to. The look on Lily's face was enough. "Go," Danielle said simply. Lily blinked. "What?" "Go home." Danielle gestured toward the door, already moving toward the counter to grab an extra apron. "I'll cover the rest of your shift." Lily's first instinct was to argue, to shake her head and say she couldn't just leave in the middle of work, that she still had tables to clear, dishes to wash, refills to make. But the words wouldn't come. The thought of standing here for another 4 hours, pretending like nothing had just happened, was unbearable. She didn't hesitate. She untied her apron, tossed it onto the counter, and mumbled a quiet, "Thank you," before heading straight for the door, barely remembering to grab her jacket on the way out. The cold night air hit her like a slap, but she barely felt it. Her mind was still spinning, still trying to process everything, still struggling to make sense of something that made no sense at all. She walked quickly, the envelope pressed tightly against her chest, as if she was afraid that if she let go, it would vanish. Her apartment wasn't far, just a few blocks away, but every step felt like she was moving through a dream she wasn't fully awake for. The sounds of the town, the distant hum of passing cars, the faint laughter from a bar down the street, felt muted, drowned out by the deafening pounding of her own heartbeat. By the time she reached the worn-down building she called home, her hands were trembling. She fumbled with her keys, her pulse thrumming in her ears, before finally managing to push the door open. The apartment was small, barely more than a living room with a kitchenette and a bedroom just big enough to fit a twin bed and a dresser, but it was home. And right now, it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Oliver was curled up on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, a sketchbook resting on his lap. His tiny fingers clutched a worn-down colored pencil as he doodled quietly, his expression peaceful despite the late hour. The sight of him, so small, so innocent, made something in Lily's chest tighten even more. He looked up when she walked in, his eyes lighting up with surprise. "Mom? You're home early." Lily tried to speak, but her throat tightened, and for a moment, she couldn't find the words. She swallowed hard, forcing a smile, and crossed the room in a few quick steps, dropping to her knees in front of the couch. She reached out, brushing a hand through his soft brown hair, her fingers shaking. "Yeah, baby," she whispered, her voice barely steady. "I am." Oliver frowned slightly, tilting his head. "Are you okay?" Lily exhaled shakily, forcing back the tears burning at the edges of her vision. She didn't want to scare him, didn't want him to see the overwhelming storm raging inside her. She wanted this moment to be something good, something pure. Instead of answering, she pulled the envelope from her pocket and placed it gently in his lap. Oliver looked at it curiously, then up at her, confusion flickering across his face. "What's this?" Lily took a slow breath, her fingers tightening against the fabric of his blanket. "It's a gift. From someone who wanted to help." Oliver's brows furrowed as he carefully unfolded the note, his small hands tracing the words with careful curiosity. His lips moved silently as he read, his expression shifting from confusion to surprise to something she couldn't quite place. When he looked back at her, his eyes were wide. "Mom, is this real?" Lily nodded slowly, her vision blurring again. "Yeah, sweetheart. It's real." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, without warning, Oliver threw his arms around her, burying his face against her shoulder. His tiny frame trembled, and Lily realized, with a sharp pang, that he was crying. She wrapped her arms around him tightly, holding him close, her own tears finally slipping free. She didn't know how this had happened, Didn't understand why someone like Jackie Chan had chosen to help her, but none of that mattered. All that mattered was that, for the first time in years, she didn't feel trapped. For the first time in years, she had hope. Lily sat on the couch, her arms still wrapped tightly around Oliver, her mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. The apartment felt different now, as if the weight that had pressed down on every corner, every creaky floorboard, every faded wall had suddenly lifted. Oliver was still clutching the note, his small hands gripping the paper like he was afraid it might disappear if he let go. He pulled back slightly, looking up at her with wide eyes, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, what are we going to do with it?" Lily inhaled deeply, steadying herself, her fingers brushing against the envelope resting between them. She had spent years budgeting every dollar, stretching meals, choosing which bills could be delayed just long enough to keep the lights on. She knew exactly how much she needed to survive, exactly how much she had never had. And now, sitting in front of her, was enough to change everything. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to think clearly. "We're going to do what's right. We're going to be smart about this." Oliver tilted his head, his brows furrowing. "Does that mean we can get a birthday cake tomorrow?" Lily let out a breath that was half a laugh, half a sob, shaking her head as she reached out to cup his face gently. "Yes, baby. You can have the biggest cake you want." His face lit up, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Lily felt like a good mother. She had spent years telling herself that love was enough, that sacrifice was necessary, that one day, things would get better if she just kept pushing forward. But the truth was, she had been tired for so long that she had stopped believing in the possibility of anything changing. Oliver's excitement was contagious, and she didn't want him to see how overwhelmed she felt, didn't want him to know that she was still trying to convince herself that this wasn't some cruel mistake. She needed to think, needed to figure out what came next. But right now, all she wanted was for her son to feel like a kid, to be happy without worrying about money or schedules or all the things he had never complained about but had always understood. "Tell you what," she said, ruffling his hair, "you go wash up for bed, and tomorrow, we'll go get you that cake. Maybe even something extra." Oliver beamed and scrambled off the couch, racing toward the bathroom before she could change her mind. Lily watched him go, her heart aching in a way she couldn't describe. She had spent his entire life trying to protect him from the harshness of the world, trying to make sure he never felt like they were struggling, even when they were. But the truth was, he had known. He had always known. Her hands tightened around the envelope again, her mind racing through the endless possibilities. Pay off the overdue rent. Get ahead on the bills. Maybe even, just maybe, move out of this tiny apartment. Find a place where Oliver could have his own room, where they wouldn't hear the neighbors arguing through the thin walls, where she wouldn't have to worry about whether the hot water would last through the night. The knock at the door startled her so suddenly that her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't been expecting anyone, and at this hour, visitors were rare. Her heart pounded as she stood, tucking the envelope into the pocket of her hoodie before cautiously making her way to the door. She hesitated for a second before unlocking it and pulling it open just enough to see who was on the other side. Her breath hitched. Jackie Chan stood in the dim hallway, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, his expression calm but unreadable. Lily's mind went blank. She had spent the last hour trying to process what he had done, trying to understand why a man like him had walked into her life and handed her something that could change everything. And now, he was standing at her door as if this was completely normal. She opened the door fully, struggling to find her voice. She swallowed hard, shaking her head in disbelief. "You're here." Jackie gave a small nod. "I wanted to make sure you got it." Lily stared at him, words failing her. Of course, she had gotten it. She had nearly collapsed when she read his note, had spent the last hour questioning whether this was real, whether it was some kind of mistake. And now, he was standing here, confirming that it wasn't. She took a shaky breath, gripping the doorframe to steady herself. "I don't understand. Why did you do this?" Jackie studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Because I could." His answer was so simple, so direct, that it took her a second to process it. He wasn't looking for recognition, wasn't expecting gratitude, wasn't here to explain himself. He had done something extraordinary and then walked away, expecting nothing in return. Lily shook her head, struggling to hold back the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "You don't even know me." Jackie's lips pressed into a small, almost knowing smile. "I didn't have to." She exhaled sharply, running a hand over her face as she let out a breathless, disbelieving laugh. This is insane. People don't just do this." Jackie shrugged. "They should." Lily opened her mouth, then closed it again, completely at a loss. No one had ever helped her like this before. No one had ever seen her struggle and stepped in without asking for anything in return. And yet, here he was. She swallowed hard, her voice unsteady. "I don't know how to thank you." Jackie shook his head. "You don't have to." He glanced past her, toward the small apartment behind her, his eyes softening. "Just take care of him." Lily turned slightly, following his gaze. Oliver stood a few feet behind her, peeking out from the hallway, his wide eyes filled with quiet awe. He hadn't said a word, but his grip on the edge of the wall was tight, as if he was afraid this moment might disappear if he moved. Jackie met Oliver's gaze and gave him a small nod. "Happy birthday, kid." Oliver's mouth parted slightly, as if he wanted to say something, but no words came out. Jackie took a step back, hands still in his pockets. "Take care of each other," he said simply. Then, without another word, he turned and walked down the hallway, disappearing down the stairs before Lily could even think to stop him. She stood frozen in the doorway, her pulse still racing, her mind still trying to catch up with everything that had just happened. Oliver stepped closer, looking up at her with wide eyes. Was that really him? Lily let out a breathless laugh, shaking her head as she looked down at the envelope still clutched in her hands. "Yeah, baby," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. That was really him. For the first time in years, things were going to be different. And for the first time in years, she let herself believe it.